Hello, everyone. Welcome to my first ever podcast episode on my new neuroscience and psychology channel. I am Camden McFarland, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Zhuang, who just recently received her PhD in developmental psychology at the University of California, Davis. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today. Would you like to start by telling me a little bit more about yourself and your research?
Yeah, really excited to be here too, Camden, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
I was really thrilled when I heard about, last time we met and described your ambitions for starting this podcast and, sharing scientific knowledge with the general public because honestly, that's like a big part of what motivated me to start my
Oh, that's
graduate.
awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, so my background actually, so my undergrad and master's background before starting my PhD was also in psychology, but in a very different domain of psychology. I was interested in uh, cognition, but also in this specific research area of dietary behaviors, like how do people make food choices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was like from that I got interested in self-regulation and what are the cognitive processes that support self-regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and stumbled upon development and just found that absolutely fascinating. Like, how do we come to become the bundle of, thoughts and behaviors and so on that
Mm-hmm.
we have as adults? Um, so then that led me to developmental psychology and pursuing a PhD, where I try to combine both my interest in self-regulation and executive functions and the cognitive processes that support healthy behaviors and well-being, and as well as seeing how those abilities develop across childhood, toddlerhood, and then into adulthood. Um, yeah, so much of my graduate studies have focused on studying how children develop executive functions, these like mechanisms, cognitive mechanisms, abilities that allow us to self-regulate, to make choices that are geared towards long-term goals as opposed to more shorter-term
Mm-hmm.
immediate gratification. And then as well as a big part of my research has been on how executive functions may be related to mindfulness in kids. Um, and along with the theme of like, how do we measure these really abstract, big concepts and cognitive processes in children? Um, so yeah, so those
Yeah.
are like the main themes of my background these so far.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. I noticed you pointed out like how do we even kind of study these things? Because executive functioning is such a large, it encompasses so much. And then also mindfulness. It's like I think we all have an idea of what mindfulness might mean. However, like breaking it down into pieces is so hard, and like in terms of actually measuring it, um, it sounds definitely extremely challenging. So, to start, I was kind of curious on what you would define as those two pieces, like executive functioning and mindfulness.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I mean, I started my graduate studies
Mm-hmm.
like saying, oh, I'm gonna answer these questions. And now at the end, I'm like, I don't know, I'm not really sure I have a like perfect answer to those two questions.
Yeah,
Which is
it's
okay.
very hard.
Yeah, like they're very complicated and multifaceted constructs. So with executive functions, like these are off. You can think, I guess I think about them at different levels of analysis,
Mm-hmm.
meaning like how, like depending on what sort of outcomes or yeah, what sort of outcomes I'm interested in, that I might define executive functions differently. So like even within my work, so starting from like the basics of cognitively and neurobiologically,
Mm-hmm.
can think of executive functions as those processes, cognitive processes that are supported by the frontal lobe
Mm-hmm.
of the brain. So the prefrontal cortex is sort of like the latest evolutionary development in human evolutionary history, as well as one of the slowest developing parts of the human brain across childhood. It takes
Oh,
up to 25 years or beyond to fully develop a mature prefrontal cortex in humans. Um, and so, as you can imagine, with this like very long, protracted development, that like what looks like executive functioning can change a lot depending on the age that we're thinking about. Like, so like when we try to measure executive functions um, in children in childhood, oftentimes we're doing these like seemingly very basic tasks to adults.
mm-hmm.
So like a very common task may be this is what's called like the head, shoulders, knees, and toes task, where you have kids like it's like a game where you ask them to start by touching your head, touch your shoulders, touch your knees, touch your toes, and it's very straightforward. Then you switch things up on them, and you like ask them to, okay, when I say touch your shoulders, you actually have to touch your knees. When I say touch your head, you actually have to touch your toes. And so there's this like engagement of these sort of like switching process, this cognitive flexibility that's needed to think, oh, okay, like now the rules have changed. Now I need to do the opposite. And with that, there also comes this inhibitory processes that need to take place where you need to stop the habitual action of doing what you're touching your knees when you're told, but instead doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so this switching, this cognitive flexibility, what's also called updating, so updating of the rules, inhibitory control, these all get talked about as aspects of basic components of executive functions, sort of like those like basic rules or operations, you may
Mm-hmm.
say, that in order for you to these accomplish these goals and adapt to changing environments. And so, yeah, so that's often how it gets described, in children. But then that's only at one layer, because other layers too, in school or
Mm-hmm.
in the home environment.
Mm-hmm.
I think executive functions tends to be talked about more in terms of how it's applied, like how well kids are able to regulate their emotions or get along with their peers or follow rules. So that's like at a level that, at least the way I see it, that's somewhat different from just the simple case of taking a measure in the lab, playing a gamified version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, executive functioning is so complex, and at least from what I learned at undergrad, I kind of associate executive functioning with inhibition, kind of like you mentioned before. I mean, not directly, however, it's just that kind of like overall control, almost like a control room type of like if you would think of it that way,
Right.
almost like the control room, and kind of you know like counteracting these sort of like instincts that we have, natural instincts. That's kind of, at least, I mean, that's more like abstract, but that's kind of how I view executive functioning. Um, and
Mhm.
so that's kind of overall, yeah, I would say that's pretty, what you mentioned is a pretty good idea of what executive functioning is. And I mean, as you said, it's so complex and it's hard to really study executive functioning, because at the end you're just pulling like pieces of that, like this like inhibition instinct that you mentioned with children. That is part of executive functioning, but again, it's just kind of like a part of it. So that's kind of executive functioning. Do you have a definition for mindfulness, or kind of an idea of what mindfulness is for you? Because like in my mind, when I think of mindfulness, my mind kind of instantly goes to things like meditation or like journaling. These are like mindfulness techniques, I would say, but just kind of being able to deal with and listen to your emotions. That's kind of what I associate with mindfulness, at least upon first glance. However, I want to see what you think about mindfulness and like if there's some pieces to that, because it is a large term.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's funny too because I think I share that same intuition with you when I first started in my program thinking, oh, like yeah, mindfulness, like it can't be that complicated. But then you dig in and you realize, wow, it's like a can of worms just as much as, any complicated construct like executive
Yeah.
functions
Yeah.
is. Um, so like and I realize that, in different perspectives and different like fields, mindfulness gets has can take on very different definitions. But in the cognitive and psychology literature, I would say like what I've seen is that mindfulness tends to get defined in terms of like two main aspects. One being this awareness of what's going on in the present moment. So that could be, awareness of internal processes, how you're breathing, how you're feeling, and then also it could also be a awareness of what's around you, like hearing the birds sing, the sunrise, and so on. Um, and so that being one component. And then the other one being having this non-judgmental attitude towards these ongoing present processes. So, no, not judging how you're feeling and being aware, but without reacting to what's going on around you. So yeah, so from the psychological and cognitive perspective, I think I see that being like a very common theme in defining mindfulness. And of course, like how it's defined tends to inform how it gets studied and how it gets measured as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think but at the same time, there's also, like a lot of like beyond outside of this perspective, I think a lot of other very valid perspectives too on mindfulness and during meditation, and from perhaps more spiritual perspectives
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of, I'm curious because these are two of your big areas of interest. How does executive functioning and mindfulness relate to each other?
That's a great question, and it's like a very hot topic of ongoing research right
Mm-hmm.
now. And so, so with the executive functions, so there's executive functions, and then there's this uh, parallel concept called cognitive control, which just adds to the complexity of what's going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
But the cognitive control tends to be thought of as like um, sometimes overlapping with executive functions, but like the cognitive control tends to be defined as like the different processes that allow you to overcome habitual actions. Um, and so exerting cognitive effort in order to overcome a habit, for
Mm,
example. And
got it.
so, like in the recent literature, that this concept of cognitive control has become talked about a lot with mindfulness. Because the thing with cognitive control is that it offers this interesting framework of thinking about how individuals engage cognitive effort, either in a reactive way, so being meaning activating control resources and inhibiting actions, for example, in an as needed basis, or in a more proactive way, where you're anticipating the need for control, and then sort of pre-biasing your inclination to act in a certain way so that you're ready. Like an example could be um, like if maybe a mindfulness related example actually could be when if you know that you tend to get um I don't know, upset when you go to the grocery store because the lines are super long.
Mm-hmm.
Then like a proactive strategy could be, okay, I'm gonna like try to go when the lines are shorter, when I know people aren't gonna be there. So that could be like an example of using proactive control to regulate. Whereas in a reactive control scenario, you may be at the store, the lines are long, notice you're starting to you could get you could feel annoyed or upset.
Mm-hmm.
So what you could do is maybe, I know, start breathing, noticing your breath, or starting to taking like these reactive strategies to self-regulate. And so in the cognitive control literature, there's a lot of talk about this dual mechanisms of cognitive control, where there's reactive and proactive strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, you can also sort of see parallels with like mindfulness, where yes, there's like a proactive strategies where you can proactively practice meditation or practice noticing, becoming aware, and being non-judgmental
Mm-hmm.
towards the present moment. And also there's this reactive process too, where like when things do come up and that you start, feeling upset or feeling, whatever it may be, that you have these reactive strategies to also address that. Um, and so, yeah, and so I think there's a lot of theoretical parallels that between executive functions and cognitive control with mindfulness, where there are likely bi-directional relationships
Mm-hmm.
between them, where one supports the other and the other sort of supports back, the original, the first one.
Yeah, yeah. Got it. Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. What impact do you think that this research field and like the direction that this is going, what impact do you think this will have on like children's lives in the future and like individuals' mental health? Like I just imagine like the more we dive into this area, the more we're able to teach kids and other people about effective ways to deal with some difficult situations in their life. And I'm just wondering, like, where do you think this is going, at least in terms of the research, and then also in terms of like the impact on people that this might have?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think so with mindfulness, like it's become a really hot topic in the last dozen plus years. And I think there's been a lot of interest in bringing mindfulness practice to schools, and to help teach children how to self-regulate and emotional as well as in the cognitive ways. Um, but recently too, there's also been some so there was a large meta-analysis, which means it's like a study of studies. So looking at like across many, many different studies, what's the effect of mindfulness in school-based interventions on children, on youth? And what this study actually found, this was conducted in Britain, and what it actually found was that not all kids benefited from mindfulness. Just like, and I think they were looking at like a multi-week intervention where kids were doing mindfulness-based activities in the classroom. Um, and they were comparing it to a control group of schools that didn't get that interventions. Um, and yeah, and what they found was that yes, while some kids did benefit, some kids also didn't benefit. And what it seemed to be was that like at least the way that the intervention that they were using was delivered, that perhaps it required their kids to have like a certain level of like like baseline, being at a certain
Mm-hmm.
baseline in order to take in the benefits from that practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because so like I think what they found was that in like kids who had pre-existing psychological conditions or difficulties, it was the case actually that like just giving this intervention, like telling them to meditate or having, doing these exercises, actually had these counter-indicatory effects where, like if they were having pre-existing psychological conditions, then just bringing awareness to that without, having that additional scaffolding perhaps, or that additional support could actually lead to, unintended effects. Um, and so I think a big take home, like from this large meta-analysis, was that, well, actually, no, we don't want to, yes, mindfulness can procure benefits for participants, but also it's important to think about who does it benefit, because it may not be the case that, everyone stands to benefit from this, and that, certain types of interventions should be catered to different populations. Um, I think that's one big thing that's in upcoming, for future directions in mindfulness research in youth. Um, But another thing have been thinking a lot about,
Mm?
is this something that maybe we're both very, relate to, is this
Yeah.
technological use,
Oh, yes. Yes.
technology. Where, wow, like how often I find like I'm just scrolling through like the news or whatever on the phone, and and it just strikes me how like, yeah, like there's this like feeling of mindlessness in it, in that process. But yeah, at the same time, like technology is so prevalent in our daily lives, and more and more so in children's daily lives. Like I think, like computer use is like almost, you can't avoid that in schools
Not at all.
anymore.
Yeah, you can't.
And it's just this like just this really intriguing double-edged sword where, like, on the one hand it does allow us to do a podcast like this, a
Hmm.
remote, that it gives us so many advantages and ways to learn. But at the same time, it also can lead to, it provides this world of like opportunities that sometimes it's hard to choose between. Like, what do I do on my phone? Oh, I'll just scroll through like my emails and then my texts and this. And there's been so strong associations found between social media use and youth well-being, psychological well-being in youth. So yeah, something I would be really interested in is like how to translate some of the work that I've been doing, looking at how do we measure mindfulness in kids and in youth, and sort of try to translate that to like, okay, like can we, like, I think first a good question I would love to ask is like, how do we assess like mindfulness around technology,
Hmm.
um, mindful technological use? How does that look like? And is it something that can be trained? Something that could be, that we can learn ourselves and also teach to younger generations. Because yeah, like I think there's like could be a lot of compelling overlaps there, of being able to, open up my phone, but like attend to it, engage with it in a mindful way. I think it could be something that is beneficial both to future youth as well as myself, probably, and ourselves.
Oh yeah. No, I absolutely agree how this area is so important because I mean, I'm just putting this onto my own life in the sense that, I notice myself mindlessly scrolling as well to the point where like I can't really think of the last time that I've just sat with my own thoughts or like just even like anytime I'm on my phone, if it's not like for any work reasons or anything, it is mindless. It is totally mindless. And it's a nice like escape from like kind of the busyness of the day and kind of like a shut off of my brain, which I appreciate at sometimes. However, I mean, also the addictive component of it makes it really, really hard to use, I think, technology in a very beneficial way on like a day-to-day basis because it is so addictive and kind of
Yeah.
hard to it's kind of this balance of like mindfulness and technology. I think there's a very real relationship there, at least that I've noticed in my life and like people's lives around me. And it would be so interesting to kind of start uncovering that and yeah, coming up with some good strategies to deal with, not like mindlessly scrolling all the time or incorporating, like you said, some sort of mindfulness aspect into this. And at least I don't know if people are doing that much now. However, I do know there's like a few apps that I have on my phone that I don't really use that often, to be honest. However, I think I think like the talk is going in this direction where people are considering different ways to potentially bring mindfulness to your phone, for example. Things like the Calm app, something like that. Now, these are, again, it's more like meditative kind of. However, just kind of like taking a minute to kind of just like be in the present moment and kind of take in, the internal sensations, external sensations, I think is important because then it does, at least I believe that that helps us in the future when we do have a lot of emotions going on, just kind of understand what's going on. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, you bring a really good point. I think it's a great example of where, there's this like gray area, the gray area between technology where it could be like right, like you can download apps that can, assist and support well-being. It like has
Hmm.
guided mindfulness exercises, and those are great to be able to have access to. And also at the same time, it's like, right next to that, right next to the mindfulness icon is like the Instagram icon. And, it's like this whole mixed bag of that then, opens up the really, I think, the question of like how do we learn to engage with technology and all these possibilities in a healthy, balanced ways. Um, and yeah, and I think it's something that I hope to explore in my next steps,
Uh-huh.
after finishing up.
Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah, and the point that you brought up about these apps being right next to like Instagram, that is exactly why I've never really used these apps. I maybe opened them like twice in my life because I download them. I think like, oh, this is gonna be such a great idea. I think it's gonna help me, just kind of take a moment, step out from this like mindlessness. However, I just end up clicking Instagram and going through like Instagram. So it's I don't know. I definitely noticed that in my own life for sure. And I'm kind of curious of if there's ways that you've figured out how to just incorporate more mindfulness in your own life. This can be like kind of separated from like research and stuff, but just like more of um, if you found maybe some mindfulness things that really help you kind of from day to day. I'm just curious if you have some of those.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's something that I've like the on and off in different ways have incorporated and try to incorporate. And I think, like you, sometimes I'm more or less successful.
Yep. Yep.
But at the same time, I think recognizing it's like all part of the journey or the process. And there's
Mm-hmm.
no like, oh, I've reached it, or oh, like I failed.
Yep.
It's this ongoing process, which is actually a big part of mindfulness. It's like not judging yourself for how good or not successful you are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, yeah, I mean, in the day to day these days, what I really like, also using technology for this, it's an app that has this mindfulness bell that rings every 20 minutes.
Uh-huh.
It's like this reminder to tune into your breath and
Oh.
notice how to take like one intentional breath and notice it. Um, and every 20 minutes it rings, and it just like reminds me to tune back into my body and resume feeling that groundedness and embodiment, which is also, which are also really big parts of mindfulness, like
Mm-hmm.
feeling embodied. And feeling that groundedness. Um, that's like a daily thing that I do. But also, back when I think one big aspect of mindfulness that don't get always talked about, is around community and how
Mm.
like the practicing mindfulness in a community. I used to do that when I was working at a New York university, where nearby they had this meditation group that would meet once a week. And that was I think that was my introduction to mindfulness actually before grad school, where, yeah, like I was just looking for, spaces to meet others, and stumbled upon this like great community where they're both in with practicing mindfulness together, and as well as sharing in their experiences. Um, and I think sometimes that aspect gets missed in a lot of like, individualized like a mindfulness app, for example, where it's just me with my phone,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Yep.
good, but it's also yeah, I think it's harder to keep up, when it's just me and my phone. And I think it misses that the potential communal aspect of, practicing together. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Honestly, that's so interesting that you brought that up because that made me think of how like anytime I think of mindfulness or like do anything mindful, I always it's just in my head I'm just doing it by myself. Like I just go to my room, just kind of disconnect. Like that's how I visualize it. And I think you bring up a really good point of how it can be so helpful to experience that with other people. Because one, I mean, it just helps you keep accountable, but also to just have that like community there, I think is, I mean, I was surprised to hear that because I don't know, I've just never thought about that, but it seems pretty. Now that you say that, it seems like obvious that that would be super helpful. Just never considered that, but that's super interesting. Definitely.
Yeah. 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 I think especially, now, like I mean, yeah, like with technology, I think it's all bundled together. And also makes me think about how, like the way that it's sort of like a transformation in the way that, bring back to the topic of executive functions.
Hmm.
How executive functions traditionally has been talked about as like sort of like an individual thing. It's like I have some capacity for inhibitory control, you have some capacity, and so on. But like more and more now, it's being recognizing the field is recognizing that it's not like, yes, like we can take measures of individuals and see how good they are at stopping or changing rules and touching their heads and shoulders and knees and toes and so on. But like a big part is like, no, we co-regulate each other. Like children learn to co-regulate with their parents based on their parents' emotions. And adults do that too with their
Hmm.
peers, with significant others, within family systems. Um, and I think there's more and more recognition now that executive functions or perhaps any psychological construct doesn't so much take place as like, individual me versus you versus the other person, but it's like in this community where co-regulation takes place and that interacts with how one individual regulates in that community. Um, and yeah, and so I think, it translates to a lot of, yeah, multiple psychological phenomenon
Definitely.
and increasing recognition.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a whole lot of sense. It's, I mean, I just feel a little ridiculous, not gonna lie, the fact that like this just doesn't come to my like it didn't come to my mind that yeah, it makes a lot of sense that this is a communal thing, and there's communal aspects to this. I think that's a very good point and something I didn't even consider before. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think the challenge is, it's harder to study when it's like, oh, if we bring it
Mm-hmm.
to like the social
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
So it's easier to study when it's just one individual at the individual level. But right,
No.
but it misses this additional dimension.
Definitely. Definitely. And I know you mentioned wanting to study, this mindfulness and executive functioning, but more in like an applicable environment of something that's a little bit like pretty realistic and not necessarily like a typical lab environment, so you can really kind of see what interactions are actually going on out there in the real world. Do you have an idea of how you're gonna go about that, or like maybe how that study is gonna kind of be in place into this like natural sort of setting?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because much of my background has been mostly using laboratory-based methodologies. Um, but yeah, like what I would love to do is like working. I mean, it's like sort of like the idea of going to where people live and work and
Mm-hmm.
do their thing in different ways. So whether it is schools, working with whether it's kids or or higher. students in higher education, and colleges, where like the idea about technology and mindfulness, that is something that's, I think, so prevalent around all of us. I
Yeah,
think, even
definitely.
just, yeah, like taking that to, assessing, doing, I think what a study could look like that I would be very interested in doing is, first, like assessing how do students and individuals engage with technology these
Hmm.
days. What are the pros and cons that they see? And then from there on, perhaps co-developing even, you know, identifying targets for intervention, like what are struggles, challenges that people face,
Hmm.
around engaging with technology in mindful ways, and then how can we bring in mindfulness to those systems such that it helps people navigate and engage with technology in healthy ways, and train, whether it's executive functions or mindfulness skills, or other aspects. And so I would be really, and that's actually a big thing that in the new institute that I'll be working with, the Crown Institute,
Hmm.
at Boulder, a big emphasis in their mission is around this idea of co-participatory research, where it's less so the traditional model of scientists in a ivory tower university coming up with studies and doing them on people, but more like co-developing that with your participants, with your target
Hmm.
population. So yes, I would love to get involved in that in the next, months and years.
Yeah, I know that's so exciting, and I'm excited that you'll be close by.
Ah,
Because yeah, actually, like the study that one of the studies in the lab that I'm in is a part of the Renee Crown Institute. So hopefully, I get to see you around and catch up about how the research is going and all
yeah.
that. I'm definitely super passionate about this area, and I think your future directions could solve some very important questions and potentially, be very, very beneficial to these kids and students in school to hopefully, so we have a better understanding of what mindfulness is, and especially related to technology, and then potentially, some interventions or some ways to help the almost like epidemic of, technology, and figuring out some positive ways to use that in people's lives. I think that I think that sounds like a great path, and I'm really excited to see how that turns out for you. Um,
Oh, and then thanks for your encouragement.
yeah, no, of course. But I don't want to take too much more of your time. But I do just want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today and sharing so much about your research and where you want to take future research. And then, all these different things about executive functioning, mindfulness, how is the connection here, and kind of some of this impact that it has in people's lives. So I really appreciate all you had to say today. And I just want to thank you again for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Camden. Thanks for having me.